What exactly is your own personal criteria for an all-time great? I don't think there's an answer out there that gets unanimous approval, but through this series, I want to help in outlining the argument for 7 different fighters as MMA's undisputed GOAT. Anderson Silva, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Amanda Nunes, George St-Pierre, Fedor Emelianenko, Demetrious Johnson, and John Jones. I won't try to deny it. These 7 fighters are not all on the same level, but each certainly has something that has established them as a cut above all others, within their respective divisions and eras. Everything else is a matter of preference. Week by week, I'll take one of these fighters, breaking down their unique claim to the throne, dropping some insight on where that claim might be hindered, before leaving the actual decision making up to you guys. I think it'll be an interesting and enjoyable dip into one of the sport's most ever-present topics, and between myself and you guys, our loyal viewers, we're gonna try and get as close as possible to finding MMA's GOAT. The more I dive into this series, the more I feel as though my ultimate notion behind my own GOAT criteria becomes distant and confused. Not that I don't have my own preferences, and I think after reading your comments, I will do a follow-up video to give my own rankings. Perhaps in the form of a 2-part top 8 video to make this series a perfect 10 videos long. But as much as I think that I'll come away from this series with a better idea of where I'll place each fighter within a top 7 or top 8 list, it certainly has become quite clear to me that these fighters all bring unique and interesting qualities to the table, ones that make them viable in their own way. Maybe I'll rename this series Celebrating MMA's GOATs and forget about drawing comparisons, but I suppose there's not enough raw clickability in that to do so I guess I'll forget about it. For now though, armed with my ever-evolving idea of what a GOAT candidate is, let's dive into a very interesting pick among our crop of hopefuls. Ahead of putting the Amanda Nunes episode together, I wanted to be fully certain of what my angle was going to be, because based on the criteria that we all hold dear in our own personal GOAT conversations, Nunes, out of the 8 names I've gathered, does seem to be on the lower end of the spectrum. But as I watched back tape and repositioned myself in each moment that the Lioness managed to surprise me, managed to upset the odds, it did begin to dawn on me that Nunes has something that none of the rest of these candidates do. A lot of the asterisks we place beside the achievements of Ronda Rousey are also held against Nunes to some extent when comparing her to the GOATs of men's MMA. Indeed, women's MMA is in its infancy in comparison, but when you consider just how much distance Amanda has been able to place between herself and her competition, that wide, unquestionably gargantuan gulf, that's where Nunes' argument begins to shine through. And look, say what you want about the difficulty of singling yourself out amongst your peers, Amanda Nunes has ushered in an era of dominance that is rare in sport, full stop. Not only has she succeeded in besting those who would challenge her position in terms of its legacy, the likes of Cris Cyborg, Ronda Rousey, Valentina Shevchenko, fighters who at one point in time were on their own collision with female GOAT status, but she also holds one of the most impressive knockout ratios against former champions in the history of the sport. Out of the 5 women to have held the UFC bantamweight or featherweight championship belts since the creation of both divisions, Holly Holm, Cris Cyborg, Ronda Rousey, Miesha Tate, Germaine de Randamie, Nunes has beaten them all, holding a first-round stoppage over each of them. Indeed, her second clash with de Randamie went a bit longer, but the point stands. The greatest strength of Nunes' legacy is that her resume is leagues upon leagues ahead of the competition, making her claim at women's GOAT status so watertight that it would be almost foolish at this point to suggest that any of her peers are greater. And though it doesn't mean that she can trump the Silvas, the Joneses, the GSPs of the world in terms of the sheer consistency and strength of schedule, her own brand of dominance, her bewildering ability to destroy the highest levels of opposition, that is something that is unique to her. She has a habit of making inarguable, definitive and stylish statements with her biggest wins, and that's the true hallmark of the Lioness's prowess. Miesha Tate came into her first title defense after shocking the world by finding a last-ditch rear naked choke finish over Holly Holm, a 5th-round Hail Mary that stood as one of the single greatest comebacks in UFC championship history. When Amanda Nunes came in and spoiled the show, she did so by battering her on the feet, making the power difference between the two known, before then tapping her by way of rear naked choke, stealing away Miesha's title with the very technique she used to win it herself. Ronda Rousey, lover or hater, is still one of the most efficient finishers to ever lace up gloves, and over the course of her 14-fight career, 12 of which she won, she managed to score 8 finishes in under a minute, with another coming after 66 seconds, one at the end of the first round in her UFC debut, and then of course 2 armbars against Miesha Tate. Rousey won 66% of her victories in the very first minute, and when Nunes got a hold of her, she gave her an almighty taste of her own medicine, TKOing her in a flawless display of brutality in what likely amounted to the longest 48 seconds of Rousey's life. And if you want to talk about taking the mantle of greatest knockout artist in women's MMA history, How about the way she stepped into the fire with the fearsome Chris Cyborg, something she did after stepping up in weight? And again, despite Cyborg being the one of the two to press the action early, Nunes managed to stay composed, picking her shots, beating her fellow Brazilian at her own game, taking all of Justino's own momentum and making it her own. Even in her subsequent defense against Holly Holm, she took on the owner of perhaps the single most famous head kick knockout in UFC history. And well, you know exactly how that turned out. I'm not trying to sit here and tell you that there's some conspiracy over Nunes being determined to beat all of her greatest rivals at their own game. I'm not even saying that this is anything more than one big coincidence. But if you want to talk about pushing yourself ahead of the competition, Amanda Nunes has managed to make statement after statement about her levels, butchering her rivals to such an extent that there is actually no conversation to be had about the women's GOAT title. And the flair with which she has beaten her rivals is something that is completely unique to her. And she's the only fighter in history to defend 2 belts consistently, keeping both the bantamweight and featherweight titles in her possession. And sure, that's more so down to the shallow nature of the 145-pound division, but either way, it's an impressive feat. So what exactly are the downsides to her argument for GOAT status? Well, if we're speaking about the women's side of the sport, there are no real drawbacks worth mentioning, or at least there is nothing that would give any of her peers an edge of any sort. In terms of the overall GOAT conversation, that's where things become a bit more dicey for Nunes. And a lot of it does come down to how you see the growth and levels of women's MMA in comparison to the men's game. Because if you want to compare and contrast the levels of technique between the two, it is clear that there's still a noticeable gulf. Now, is that Amanda's fault? Absolutely not. And with the challenges that she has been presented with the opportunities that she's been afforded, she's done an unbelievable job. And if you look at her best wins, Cyborg, Rousey, Holm, Shevchenko, they do stack up well against some of her fellow GOATs in terms of prestige. But as the old saying goes, a high tide raises all ships, and all of these fighters named have served to elevate the standard of women's MMA in recent years, just as Nunes and Shevchenko are elevating it further now. But compared to the multiple eras and evolutions we've seen in the men's game, it could well be said that due to its relative infancy, it is difficult to call Amanda's career greater than some of her competition in this series, due to the layers and depth of improvement that her rivals' divisions have had the chance to have, comparatively speaking. Because other than that, you really can't knock Nunes. Sure, a few of her title defenses weren't as savage as the rest, but after 9 combined championship bouts, she has just continued to win and win and win. The strength of the 135-pound, and in particular the 145-pound divisions, aren't the fault of their champion, and all things considered, Amanda Nunes has handled the challenges that she has been presented with spectacularly well. Comparing the men's and women's sides of MMA is truly a pointless endeavor. Both sides haven't been dealt the same hand, and it's not even close. But at the same time, it doesn't matter who Amanda Nunes is when she leaves the octagon. This is one of the greatest mixed martial artists of all time. A fighter who has made her argument unavoidable, bringing results to the table that are just so damn impressive. And though her days within MMA seem to be numbered, as she continues to hint that her time in the sport is coming to its end, if she can finish her career on this current hot streak, perhaps with another fight and victory over Valentina Shevchenko before all is said and done, then who knows? We might be having another conversation entirely about the Lioness and her place within the overall MMA history books. For now, the 135-pound and 145-pound divisions are in very safe hands, folks. But what do you think of Nunes and her unique position within the overall GOAT conversation? And where does she fall on your own personal list? Do let us know in the comment section below. We're still in the earliest stages of this series and the response has been great so far, so do be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. We've also gotten through episodes 1 and 2, which deal with Anderson Silva and Khabib Nurmagomedov, so be sure to check them out if you haven't already. Thank you for watching.